you, everyone. Uber, friend or foe? Perhaps some of you have actually used Uber. I myself was once a taxi driver. So today, I'm going to give you my thoughts on Uber, friend or foe. So if we start with just a backdrop of Uber, a little bit of history from what I understand. I've never used them, but I've read a lot about them. They have an application where you can plug into your mobile phone, and wherever you are, you can get an Uber cab, and they come by and pick you up. And I believe it started more as someone, if they were going to work possibly or leaving work, they would maybe pick up a rider along the way, almost as if someone would list something on Craigslist and they just kind of swap that way. But it's kind of grown into a full-blown taxi service, not just in Chicago, but in most major cities in the U.S. and a lot of countries all over the world. So we can start with some pros. Like I said, I've never used Uber, but I've read a lot about it. Some pros of Uber, from what I've heard, many times it's actually cheaper. I hear friends bragging that they went across the city for $7 or $8 when a cab sometimes can be $15. Some people have complained that the Chicago cabbies are not the nicest bunch, and these educated Uber drivers, they're so friendly and clean and they're just great. So they say the service is better. And like I said in the beginning of my speech, if you're in the middle of nowhere, let's face it, if you have an app, they can see where you are and pick you up right away, as opposed to a cab where it might take maybe an hour to get to. So there are definite advantages. Now some of the cons, and like I said, I'm a cabbie, so I have some experience. The first thing is some people think it's unfair because they don't play by the same rules as cabbies. If you have a cab medallion, if you have a cab, you have to have a medallion, and you have to pay a city fee of $200,000. And there's a lot of reasons for this that cabs are regulated in the first place. When I drove a cab, one of the reasons why they limited the amount of cars on the street is if you have too many cars, no one's going to make a living, and it's going to constantly be not enough drivers or too many drivers, depending on if they're making money or not. So they had to kind of have a number of drivers that works. So that's one of the cons. Uber doesn't play by the same rules. A few of the other things is sometimes Uber is actually more expensive. They have a service where during peak periods the price goes up and it costs you more. But a few other facts about Uber that I think I know a lot of people don't understand, is whereas most cabs are local and the money you're putting into the driver's pocket. And by the way, when I drove a cab, it was not a good middle class job, but it was basically a lower middle class job where you can save money and raise a family. And Uber now has become more of a part-time job. But going back to what I was going to say, Uber is actually funded really by big Wall Street money. They've raised billions of dollars from Wall Street. And the funny thing about Uber is also the taxi cab business has always been considered a low margin business. Yet Uber, like I said, they're in other cities and other countries, but they have a market cap, they're valued at $50 billion. So how can they be giving these cheaper fares in a low margin business, yet be valued at $50 billion? Another thing about Uber is right now they're not profitable. They're actually a money-losing operation, and many people have talked to some people, and they're like, well, how could they be losing money? They just have drivers that have their own cars, and they just assume Uber is one or two guys at headquarters that are plugging all this information in the software, but the fact is that's not true. I was in the car today, and I actually heard a commercial looking for Uber drivers. The fact is they pay their drivers bonuses, and what I think is going on is, I think in San Francisco, Uber has 50% of the market, but let's say in Chicago, maybe they have 10%. But what's happening is they're trying to get as much business they can, almost like create a monopoly, or maybe now because they're funded by at least $1 or $2 billion of Wall Street money. And in my previous speech, I mentioned also that because interest rates are at 0%, money is cheap, it's looking for places to invest, why not? So they're getting this cheap money, they're running a money-losing operation, they're winning over lots of customers, yet where is that going to take us if you look out in 5 or 10 years if Uber has 50% of the Chicago market, or 70%. And they've had their IPO on Wall Street, and they need to start generating profits. If they're not regulated by the city of Chicago, just maybe a small bit of regulation, who's to say those fares might not double or triple a few years down the road once they get rid of the cabs. So these are just some things I thought of. And also some people think one of the reasons Uber runs cheaper is because they have less insurance coverage. There was a story of an Uber driver. He was looking at his app in San Francisco, and I believe he killed a mother or the daughter, both of them or one of them, I'm not sure. And it was contested in court, and Uber had said they're not responsible. So there's a lot of different issues. And I know I did this as a table talker once, but does anyone have any pro or con personal experiences about Uber? Ken?
Yeah, I took a Uber car in New York City, and the driver told me, I hadn't realized this, that New York City is supportive of Uber drivers because the tax revenues to the city increases. Since every Uber transaction is a credit card transaction, there's no cash payments that slip by the tax system. So from the perspective of the city, the state, and the government, Uber is actually financially advantageous compared to cabs.
That's a good point, Ken, because a lot of cab drivers, actually I was a cab driver, although I did report all mine.
I'm sure.
Of course you did.
I've heard there are some drivers that don't, whereas an Uber driver, I think they get 75% of the fare and they actually get a check sent to them. So all that money is reported, but there's a lot of other fees that Uber drivers don't pay that cab drivers do pay. As I said, a taxi medallion that the city gives out costs $250,000, which I think Uber for the whole city, they don't even pay that much to cover all their cars. So there's a lot of fees, although they might get more tax revenues, there's a lot of fees that cities and states don't get because they're a lot less regulated. So these are just some of the things I thought of, but the main thing is to keep in the long term, like I said, what's Uber going to be like in 10 years? And also, just in closing, think of your own job. Ken, you're a professor, or Pat, if you could put yourself in the position of a teacher or a nurse, or Tim, maybe you owned a small shop down the street. What if someone opened the shop next door and they didn't have a license, or someone was a nurse and they didn't have and they're willing to do it at half the cost? I mean, where does it end? Granted, a driver is a less skilled position, but you see where I'm headed. So hopefully I've given you some food for thought, and Uber, pro or con, undecided at this point.